Hello, welcome back to my channel. I am Four Corners of the Page. I'm really glad you're here now. Today I want to talk about Dungeon Crawler Carl, which is one of my favorite series. It's certainly in the top three. Now, if you asked me 2 years ago, I didn't even know this series existed. It wasn't on my TBR or anything like that. I simply posted on Reddit. I said, I want to hear some lit RPGs, self-pub lit RPGs that you would recommend because I know nothing about this space. And this was the book that just got recommended over and over again. Well, not this one. Book one was the first one that was recommended to me. And I read that first book again in August, about a year and a half ago. Fell in love instantly. And I think I did it at the same time as so many people. I can't say I got on this train early whatsoever. I rode the wave with everybody else of discovering just how amazing this series is. What I'll try and do is I'll try and keep this video fairly spoiler-free. However, if you are quite sensitive to spoilers, you might want to stay away. I'm not going to mention any cast members who might be alive by a certain point, with the exception of the main pair. And I might mention, for example, that I might find the climax of a certain book not very interesting, but I won't go into details. So if that's something that bothers you, yeah, maybe better stay away. But I think it's important I can give some sort of detail as I justify my opinions here. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 7 books, which I love to pieces, and I'm going to put them in a line. My ranking, I think, might be quite close to what some people would hold. And then for others, I think there's a couple of maybe controversial picks. And I am going to include This Inevitable Ruin, which I've read. I'm still looking forward to the audiobook. And when the audiobook is released, I will put out a dedicated spoiler review of This Inevitable Ruin. But I'll be especially wary of spoilers for book 7 because I know a lot of people are still looking forward to that one. Guys, Dungeon Crawler Carl, if you haven't read it, it's fantastic. It's got this wonderful blend of that death game scenario, the Running Man, Hunger Games, Squid Game, Alice in Borderland, married to this wonderful sci-fi parody spoof similar to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, quite similar to Ratchet and Clank. I think a lot of people are missing out on comparing those two series because I think there's a real connection there. Even the book at the bottom that's coming up, I would still say is very worth your time, very worth reading. There are no stinkers in this series. This is a book and an author who I want to do more videos on in the future. I really want to go into Matt Dinniman's backlog, for example. Dominion of Blades, I believe, was his first book or one of his earlier books. You've got Kaiju Battlefield Surgeon, that came before, I think, the first Dungeon Crawler Carl. And this is where he found his success, but I do want to explore maybe more books in his bibliography. So look for that going forward on the channel, if that's something you're interested in. And if anyone wants to talk about Dungeon Crawler Carl with me, oh man, I'm up for that conversation. But for now, I don't want to witter too long, I don't want to gush too long about the series, or that will happen, I do guarantee it. I want to just go through books 1 to 7 and tell you where my opinion falls on them. And I'm going to start with Dungeon Crawler Carl. I'm going to do it in publication order. Dungeon Crawler Carl, for me, is wonderful. It's the Philosopher's Stone of this series. Very different tone, but that similar thing. You've got a shorter page count, you've got to establish the world, you've got to get us invested in these characters, and you've got to keep us entertained. And this book does it all just fantastically. There are so many moments in this book that just feel giddyingly, joyfully inventive. I don't think there's any series I've read that is quite so just page by page entertaining and inventive as Dungeon Crawler Carl is, and this book pulls that off magnificently. I would say that both this book and the book that follow have a sort of 2-part structure. It almost feels like 2 books kind of crunched into one. It doesn't bother me here. I think that transition between the floors is very seamless, and that it allows us to kind of see that increase of level while still feeling quite organic at the same time. But yeah, from the discovery of the game guides, to the various factions, to the boss battles, there's just so many fun things that you get to find out about for the first time. I've read the series twice, and I would say Dungeon Crawler Carl even just holds up on a reread. I still think it comes across really well as you get to discover that stuff all over again and see how many links, I don't know if they're on purpose or not, are established between book 1 and all the way up to book 7, which is where we're up to now. Absolutely spectacular series debut. And I would put Carl's Doomsday Scenario, I'm going to whistle through these a little bit faster. Carl's Doomsday Scenario for me is number 6. Still a really good book. That 2-part structure, I think, holds this book back a little bit more for me, only because it's more obvious here and because I think I prefer the first half. And again, maybe that circus tent behind me is appropriate. You know what I'm talking about. I enjoyed that part of the story more than the half that follows. So for me, there was a slight deflation as this book went on, but I mean, there's still just wonderful stuff going on. And I love this introduction of the quests that pop up, and that you might not necessarily pass them, and they might not go as anyone's expecting. I think it adds a good fresh twist, because I think if you had Dungeon Crawler Carl 7, 8, 9 times, that would get stale. And what book 2 does really well is it shows you know every single book you can expect a new trick. I was going to say gimmick, maybe that's not quite fair, but a new twist on this formula that Matt Divineman has created. Book 2, love it to pieces. Number 6 is not a dig at it by any stretch. The only book that I would say I have some misgivings about is the Dungeon Anarchist's Cookbook. There are so many good things about this book. Some people put it as number 1 or number 2. I think actually it seems to split people. For me, it is at the bottom, and that is just for the reason that Matt Divineman himself puts in the foreword or the introduction to it. It's just a bit confusing. The way the world of book 3 is set up, it's not that it necessarily confuses me. I didn't spend ages trying to figure out what was going on, because I was advised not to by the fans, and I was advised not to by Matt Divineman himself in his comments. But what it did do, it had this effect to me. It almost felt as though the 2/3 of the book were happening in sort of a white room, where I couldn't quite work out where we were spatially, geographically. All we had was the characters kind of talking to each other, and something weird, hazy going on behind in the background. There are some moments in this book that are absolutely top tier, though. There's a specific scene, and you probably know what I'm talking about, towards the end of book 3, which is just top 3 moments in the whole series, and that is saying something. I'm not going to say any more about it, because I did promise to keep this slightly spoiler-free, but you'll know what I'm talking about. It's just the world that book 3 generates is not quite as much for me as the later books. But you can tell how much I love this series by the fact that I read these first 3 books. I now put them at the very bottom of the 7-book tier list, and they were still good enough to keep me reading, which just shows how magical I do find this story. Gate of the Feral Gods, maybe slightly more unpopular opinion, I put that really high. It actually just squeaks out of second place. Gate of the Feral Gods is not a novel, is my controversial take. It's a series of short stories. You do have this overall plot thread, but it's secondary just to the madcap, zany craziness from beat to beat to beat to beat. And this book is just continuous explosions. And I love it for that. I think it works really well. This is also when the characters, I would say, maybe book 3, you could say this as well, start to develop and become, they move from good to really excellent. This even continues even further into book 5. But book 3 has that sense of development and maturity in a series about talking cats called Donut, and all the other stuff that I don't want to get into. Book 3 really, it begins to grow, not just the word count on the page, but also the complexity, both from a character standpoint and the wider world of the Dungeon Crawler Carl story. I think this book doesn't get the recognition it deserves. I think it's a sleeper hit, if that makes sense. I think a lot of people put this book quite low down. I don't think it deserves it at all. And the ending is what got my sister convinced to read this book. My brother and my sister, Dungeon Crawler Carl, it's the only series that my brother and sister, outside of like Harry Potter, that my brother and sister have both read, who are not massive readers, and have both enjoyed. So if that's not an accolade, I don't know what is, but it's the ending of book 4. When I pitched it to both of them, that's what got them invested in the series. So, Gate of the Feral Gods, marvellous. Read it. Yes. Good. But The Butcher's Masquerade. Oh, The Butcher's Masquerade is number 1, and I don't think this is too unpopular a choice. I talked about the development of character and the development of complexity of these characters. The Butcher's Masquerade is where it really just goes to 11 out of 10. I never thought I would die for a cat before, especially as a dog person. But The Butcher's Masquerade made me convinced that I would. There are so many quiet moments in The Butcher's Masquerade that just work so well. I listened to this one on audiobook as I was walking around town, and there were moments where I just paused the book and kind of went, "Aw." Fabulous. And that is also met with this really wonderful story that takes a darker tone. In an apocalyptic book series where humanity is slowly getting whittled down to nothing, The Butcher's Masquerade has some truly dark moments, and those dark moments come from, again, that development of character. Because there's only so dark you can make the world before it becomes repetitive, but the way that it begins to alter the people who we are experiencing the story through, and how they are beginning to suffer and feel almost taunted by the situation they're in, really gives us an extra layer. A big boost. Butcher's Masquerade is the best Dungeon Crawler Carl book so far. Again, I don't think that's a controversial opinion. It deserves to be up there, though. And again, the ending is spectacular. And I love the song that happens. And that's all I'll say about that. Bedlam Bride, middle of the pack. I would say that this suffers from the same thing as book 7, which is just that slight over complexity, especially towards the end. And that kind of does get acknowledged later on as well, that this can be a slight flaw, I would say, of Matt Dinniman's writing. Is it a flaw of his, or am I an idiot? That's another question. But yeah, there is a couple of moments in The Eye of the Bedlam Bride where I can't quite visualise what's going on, or I'm not quite certain about the mechanics of what just unfolded before me. It wasn't as significant here as it was for book 3, which is why it's so much higher. And again, you have that layering of the story. I also do think that the card mechanic, and that's not the part of the story that fazed me, is a really wonderful idea. I love the idea of Dungeon Crawler Carl plus Pokemon cards. Again, the inventiveness continuing into book 6 is something really special. And now, you can probably tell where I put book 2. Book 7, in second place. This Inevitable Ruin. If you haven't read it yet, you are in for an absolute treat. I understand why you would wait for book 7, because that narration is just so flippin' brilliant. I couldn't wait. This is a really, really wonderful story. I've heard Matt Dinniman, maybe I'm misremembering this, talk about maybe some anxiety is too strong, but him being a bit uncertain by the length, because you can see if you look back here, it is a pretty massive story. I think it deserves to be this long. I don't think the fact that it's this long is a flaw. I think it's a strength. Again, keeping this relatively spoiler-free, This Inevitable Ruin is the most exhausting book I've ever read. In that way, it's kind of a twin to The Gate of the Feral Gods. There is so much going on page to page to page, but I think it handles that explosivity more deftly than The Gate of the Feral Gods. You have this kind of slower beginning where there's a slow creeping build of tension, expectation, because the lid is about to come off, and the lid comes off in about 4 or 5 different ways without spoiling anything. The ending is just... I'm not going to say anything. I will save that for the dedicated spoiler review, but needless to say, I am very pleased with how the ending panned out, except sometimes the last 50 pages, but that's maybe an issue in all of the Dungeon Crawler Carl books as they start to get ready for what's coming next. I could say so many things, and I'm going to leave it there, but I want you to know, I'm going to say one more thing actually, but I just want you to know this book is absolutely worth the wait. If you're like me and you jumped on about the time book 6 was published or book 5 was published, and this is the first time you've been waiting to read it, it's glorious. You're going to have a great time. The final thing I'll say about This Inevitable Ruin is a personal anecdote. I went home to, well, not Scotland, I went to Ireland. My grandmother last year was very sick and unfortunately passed away. And I went home to see her for the last time. And while I was there, silver lining, I did manage to pick up my copy of This Inevitable Ruin. And I took it with me on the plane back to Kuwait, which is where I am right now. And so on the plane that day, and it was maybe 3 days, this whole trip in total, it was fly there and fly back, I spent that entire second travel day reading This Inevitable Ruin. I got through about 500 pages in the space of about a day. Didn't quite finish it, but the main thrust of the story got me through what was quite a difficult day. I just said goodbye to a family member. I'd gotten on a plane, heading away from most of my family to come back here. And this book was a really lovely piece of escapism. And that's also the reason that I haven't reviewed it so far, actually, is that I want to give it that reread to make sure that my opinion maybe isn't skewed by that. But a couple of months have passed since I had this time, and it still holds up in my memory. I don't think it is rose-tinted glasses. And so when I reread it in a month's time, I think we're going to find out. But I am very optimistic that second place is where it deserves to be. And in any other series, it would probably be first place. That's my ranking. I'm not going to draw out this conclusion any further. Again, expect more Dungeon Crawler Carl stuff on this channel in the near future, or certainly Matt Dinniman related stuff. In the meantime, let me know your opinion. I'd gladly hear where you think I'm wrong and where you agree with me. But in the meantime, have a wonderful time, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.